Howdy, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 ConocoPhillips White House Lecture Series. My name is Mark Welsh, and I'm lucky enough to be the Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M, and just your welcomer for this evening before I turn it over to the real pros. The event tonight is hosted by the Mosbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy at the Bush School, along with the George and Barbara Bush Foundation. A special thanks from all of us here in College Station to CEO Ryan Lance and the entire ConocoPhillips leadership team for making this event possible year after year. Representing ConocoPhillips and their CEO tonight is Mr. Andrew Lundquist, the Senior Vice President for Congressional Relations. Also, I'm very proud to say a member of the Bush School Advisory Board. I think this is going to be an especially significant event as we celebrate together again the Mosbacher Commerce Department team. Kind of a cool reunion of sorts. I think you're going to enjoy this. I know that we've been looking forward to it. I think you'll understand if you have had any idea what the guest list looks like for tonight, that there are way too many VIPs joining us tonight to be able to introduce all of you. So my apologies that I'm going to clump some people into groups that I would normally be really glad to ask to wave and stand up in front of the crowd where we in a live event. Let me start by introducing the members of the family of Secretary Mosbacher who joined us tonight. Mr. Robert Mosbacher Jr., his son, Ms. Lisa Mears, his daughter, his other daughter, Dee Mosbacher, is with us this evening. Nanette Gartrell, the daughter-in-law, Meredith Mosbacher, a granddaughter, and then Jane Mosbacher Morris, another granddaughter, are all with us this evening. And thank you so much for joining us and for carrying on your grandfather tradition. It's really exciting to have you with us. We also have a number of Mosbacher Energy Company former employees. I will not introduce you all, but thank you for joining us. We have a number of other members besides the panelists who served on the Mosbacher Commerce Department team. And thank you for joining us tonight. We have a number of Bush 41 administration alumni here as well. And let me just highlight a couple. First of all, Ms. Jean Becker, a longtime Chief of Staff for President Bush. Ambassador Chase Untermeyer, also a member of our Bush School Advisory Board and an alumni of the 41 administration. We have George and Barbara Bush Foundation trustees here tonight, a number of them, a number of our Bush School Advisory Board members. We have community leaders from around Bryan and College Station and a couple from Houston. We have leaders from Texas A&M University. Mr. Mike Hardy from our Congressional Liaison Office is representing our University President, John Junkins, tonight. There are a number of special friends of the Bush School and the Mosbacher Institute with us tonight. I'd like to highlight two of them. First, Ms. Judy Leigh Allen. It's wonderful to have you here, Ms. Allen, and Mr. Ellie Simmons. We have a number of other distinguished guests here as well, and I'm going to mention just a couple. First, former Congressman Bill Flores, now back home in College Station. Welcome home, neighbor, and thank you for leading us for all those years. Mr. Max Angerholzer, the new CEO of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, is here tonight. Max, it's wonderful to have you in the seat, and we're looking forward to a long partnership together. Mr. Kalen Cheatham, who is the student regent for the Texas A&M University System Board of Regents, is on the call tonight, as is former Governor of Michigan, Governor John Engler. Governor, thank you, sir. Ms. Kathleen Gibson is with us tonight, who's the chair of the Texas A&M Foundation Board of Trustees and also a Bush School Advisory Board member. Kathleen, it's always wonderful to have you with us. We also have Ambassador Craig Stapleton here tonight from the 43 administration, Ambassador Charles Cobb, and a special guest is our new executive director of the Bush School teaching site that just opened in Washington, D.C., Texas A&M's first educational venture into the nation's capital. Retired Air Force Lieutenant General Jay Silveria is joining us tonight. We also have the former CEO of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, Mr. David Jones, joining us. David, thanks for your long service to the foundation, and it's great to have you with us tonight. Okay, my job is done, except for one last thing. I need to introduce you to the esteemed director of the Mosbacher Institute. This guy is a phenomenal scholar. He's an even better human. Dr. Raymond Robertson. Ray, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome, Dean Welsh. It's such an honor to serve with you at the Bush School. And howdy to all of our guests. It's great to be here tonight with so many friends and the distinguished guests that we have. Thank you for joining us. Let me also start by saying what an honor it is for me to direct the Mosbacher Institute, which is named, of course, after the late Robert A. Mosbacher, President George H.W. Bush's dear friend and Secretary of Commerce from 1989 to 1992. I personally have been excited about this event. this reunion ever since I became the director of the Mosbacher Institute, because we at the Mosbacher Institute want to be the home of the Mosbacher legacy, which includes our distinguished panelists and, of course, so many of our guests here tonight. I'm really excited to learn more about Secretary Mosbacher's leadership and accomplishments from this outstanding and really jovial group of his senior officials this evening. In Secretary Mosbacher's memoir, he described this team as a group of young Turks that he assembled to help preserve and enhance the department's clout, which they did, of course, to great success. I'm going to try and keep my introductions brief so that we can have more time to hear from our guests, but longer biographies can be found in the program, and a link to that program can be found in your chat. I'd like to begin with Mr. Tom Callamore, who spent more than 10 years as the Chief Communications Officer at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and 14 years with the Altria Group as Vice President of Corporate Public Affairs. During the George H.W. Bush administration, Callamore served as Chief of Staff and Assistant Secretary of Commerce under U.S. Secretary Robert Mosbacher. He was also Assistant Secretary of Commerce for administration. Previously, he served in the White House on Vice President Bush's senior staff, traveling with Bush, visiting more than 30 countries and all 50 states. And he was a senior traveling aide throughout the campaign for president, culminating with Bush's 1988 election. Callamore now serves as a senior advisor to the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, representing the foundation in Washington, D.C., and he truly deserves the credit for pulling this group of panelists together. Thank you, Tom, so much for all of your help and for being here with us tonight.
Great to be with you.
I'd like to next introduce Ambassador Susan Schwab, who served in President George W. Bush's cabinet as the U.S. Trade Representative from 2006 to 2009. Previously, under President George H.W. Bush, she worked for U.S. Secretary of Commerce Robert Mosbacher as Assistant Secretary of Commerce and the Director General of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service, the export promotion field operation of the U.S. government. In the private sector, she was the Director of Corporate Business Development for Motorola, Inc. And in academia, she served as Dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland and Vice Chancellor of the University System and as President, CEO of its foundation. She still teaches classes and executive programs in international trade. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador. It's such an honor to be here with you tonight.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I'd like to now introduce Bruce Soll, who has served more than 35 years as counselor and advisor to boards, senior U.S. government officials, and family offices. Bruce served at L Brands in Columbus, Ohio from 1991 through 2020. And prior to joining L Brands, he served as counselor to U.S. Secretary of Commerce Robert Mosbacher. He has also served as an advisor to senior U.S. government officials focusing on policy matters, including trade and technology. He presently serves or has served on numerous boards, including the Columbus Downtown Development Corporation, the Nationwide Children's Hospital, and the Ohio Export Promotion and Trade Council. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Counselor Soll. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
And next, I'd like to turn to Wendell Wilkie, who's an adjunct fellow of the American Enterprise Institute and an adjunct law professor at New York University. Until 2015, Wilkie was a member of the executive leadership of Midwest Vaco, a multinational manufacturing company. Under President Reagan, Wilkie was associate counsel to the president and also the chief of staff and general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education. Under President George H.W. Bush, he served as general counsel and acting deputy secretary to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Robert Mosbacher. President George W. Bush appointed him to the President's Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations, and we are extremely honored to have you with us. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Wilkie.
Thank you.
And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Wayne Berman, who's our moderator and chief this evening. Berman is a senior managing director and head of global government affairs for Blackstone, a leading global investment business. Prior to joining Blackstone, Berman was the vice chairman of Ogilvy and Mather and had extensive career in the insurance brokerage business. Berman's political experience includes a variety of positions in 9 different presidential campaigns, starting with the Reagan-Bush campaign in 1980. Berman served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce to U.S. Secretary Robert Mosbacher, appointed by President George H.W. Bush and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Apparently, Secretary Mosbacher constantly relied on Wayne for advice and would refer to him as his right arm, which was slightly in jest because, of course, Secretary Mosbacher was left-handed. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us here tonight. I will now, with great pride, turn the program over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ray. We're all delighted to be here to remember our mentor and dear friend Bob Mosbacher. It's a rare occasion when I hear the phrase "Young Turks" anymore, as applied to at least three of my colleagues on this panel. I still hear that about Susan because in the Bush cabinet, she actually was, I think, the youngest person. I'll leave you all to judge what that means. We're all delighted to be here, particularly pleased that Rob and Lisa D and Nanette, who we saw fairly regularly when we were all working for Bob, would come and visit at Commerce, and delighted to have their kids as well. I'm very happy to have one of my great friends in politics, John Engler, with us, who I've known. Tom Collmore and I have known and worked with for, I don't know, 100 years or so. I'm here in Washington, D.C., and obviously on a very historic day, the beginning of the second impeachment trial of former President Trump. Many Americans look at that on television and think Washington is broken. The acrimony, the absence of civility, these endless partisan wars, lots of spin, very little substance, and sort of a chronic lack of transparency. Pardon me. So, I think when we look at Bob's 3 years at the helm of the Commerce Department, it's a great example of how his amazingly positive can-do, we're going to get this done attitude, his talent for team building, always searching for bipartisan agreement. And Bob's greatest attribute was he was an amazingly good listener. And he really knew how to create consensus. He also was a gentleman. And one of the things that Washington lacks, it seems to me now, is any sense of people that have respect for each other and really respect for just the civil society that we live in. Bob had very strong points of view. He aggressively pursued his policy goals, but he always had respect for other views. He was a very transparent guy. As a matter of fact, Bruce and I spent a lot of time trying to convince him to be a little less transparent about his views. If you wanted to know what Bob was thinking about anything, you just had to ask him. He would tell you. He really felt that being transparent was part of being a conservative and being able to govern. Bob never passed the buck. He never blamed anybody else. He made tough decisions and he owned his decisions, something that in recent administrations, I think, has really been lacking. Bob always told us to tell him the truth, and he always spoke truth to power. But he did it in private, and you would have never read about it in the newspaper. He allowed all of us to dissent and disagree. As a matter of fact, he encouraged it within the organization. He never bullied anyone or tried to silence anyone. He was interested in what people had to say. He also believed that once he made a decision, it was time to go execute. And he behaved that way himself with respect to the advice that he gave the president, his friend, George H.W. Bush. Interestingly, Bob never served a day in government until his confirmation as Secretary of Commerce. And so while we're here, we'll discuss how, as somebody who did not come in with years of experience, dealt with some of the biggest partisan controversies, like on the census, on NAFTA, and technology transfer, all the while avoiding these bitter partisan fights with Congress. I want to start with team building because that was an essential part of how we started, all of us started helping Bob put a team together at the Commerce Department. I do remember being in a car with Bob, and of course this was in the back seat. Bob, I don't think had ever sat in the front seat of a car unless it was by mistake. But we were in the back seat, and it was the old days when you had a car phone. You had these big clunky car phones. And Bob decided he was going to offer Wendell Willkie the job as general counsel. And he dialed the number, and 3 times in a row, he dialed Bill Bennett, who had recommended Wendell to Bob. Finally, I took over the dialing, which was one of the few things I thought I was capable of doing with technology. we managed to get Wendell on the phone, and he and Bob had a long conversation, and Wendell agreed to join as general counsel. As far as finding Bruce, Bob one day during the transition said, listen, Bruce Saul is going to come in and be your deputy because you need somebody who's smart and organized. And I said, Bob, I'm kind of taking that a little personally. He said, good, I meant it that way. He said, Max Fisher thinks the world of Bruce, and Max is my mentor. And so we're going to bring Bruce in to clean up after you, Wayne, and all the mess that you, I know, are going to make. Now, Tom's recruitment was a little bit easier. The president-elect called Bob and said, Bob, I'd really like it if you'd think about hiring Tom Cullimore for the assistant secretary for management job. And so Bob said, well, I think that'd be a great idea. And Bob mentioned it to me that day, and I didn't get around to calling Tom. And that night I was at the vice presidential residence where President-elect was still living at a reception. And the president-elect came over to me and said, so how are we doing about Tom Cullimore? And I, of course, lied through my teeth and said, sir, we're doing great. He's all set. He's right there. We'll get him. He's going to be on board tonight. So the next day, Tom joined us. And then I'm going to let Susan, if I may, tell the story of her recruitment because I think it's a fun one.
Thank you, Wayne. It is a fun one, but it is also a good set of lessons about career development and personal development. I didn't know Secretary Mosbacher. I didn't know Wayne Berman. And I got a call one day from this guy, Wayne Berman, who I was working on the Hill at the time for Senator John Danforth from Missouri. And this guy, Wayne Berman, called me up and said, Secretary Mosbacher is interested in talking to you about potentially coming into the Department of Commerce. Would you like to sit down and talk to him? I said, sure. Wayne set up a lunch, and I sat down with Secretary Mosbacher and somebody who was going to be a senior trade person. And my field was trade policy, and I felt pretty good about my trade policy chops. And Secretary Mosbacher proceeds to ask me about the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service, which is, as was noted, the export promotion arm of the U.S. government. It's a big field operation. And quite frankly, in 1989, it was a disaster, a management nightmare. And it really was a management job. It was not a trade policy job. It was a trade promotion job, which is what I explained to Secretary Mosbacher. And I said, frankly, I'm a trade policy person, and what you need is a manager. And Secretary Mosbacher said to me, no, you need a manager. And I said, well, I'm really, quite frankly, a trade policy person. Thank you very much. End of the discussion. I thought, well, there's 2 or 3 more trade policy jobs there, and hopefully he'll understand and give me one of those. Fast forward, I get this phone call from Wayne Berman. Congratulations, Susan. President Bush signed off last night on your nomination to be Director General of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service. And my head is spinning because I am scared to death about this job because I have never managed anything other than a really tiny office. And a couple lessons here. And I was thinking about turning it down. I happened to run into Mrs. Danforth, who was in the office that day. And I explained to Senator Danforth and Mrs. Danforth what had happened and how shaken I was. Mrs. Danforth's response was, you obviously consider this an important agency. Are you telling me that you're not wanting to take this job because you're scared you'd fail? And I had to say, yeah, that's the case. And she said, well, that's not a good excuse. So Secretary Mosbacher was good to his word. He helped me get cleared a senior career civil servant as my principal deputy, a fellow by the name of Joe Vasquez, who was a magnificent manager. And between the two of us, we worked our what's off with Wayne's help, with Tom's help, with the secretary's help, and really turned that agency around. And I think everybody would acknowledge today that it is a very, very effective agency. But that was a great lesson for me, and the most important job and professional lesson I think I learned in my life. So Thank you to Wayne, and thank you to Secretary Mosbacher, who, by the way, brought in an unbelievable number of senior women into our team at the Commerce Department.
Well, that's for sure. Bob was really an innovator, and I think way ahead of his time, particularly for a Republican administration, at that time, and recruiting a lot of women into senior jobs. He, I think, didn't really give it a second thought. He just wanted the very best people. In the case of me and Bruce, he couldn't find the best people, but he settled for us. It's interesting, Susan, you came from Capitol Hill. Bob, of course, was not a congressional guy. He didn't have a political experience. He obviously had a lot of campaign experience going back to previous presidential campaigns as one of the major fundraisers and advisors to presidents and presidential candidates. But we ran into some pretty tough customers on the Hill. And I can remember Bruce and Tom and Wendell and I talking to Bob before he would go up to meetings and saying, gee, we're going to have a tough time with Senator Hollings or Senator Lautenberg or one of these more liberal Democrats. And the amazing thing was, after 5 minutes, Bob he was able to work them into a real conversation. And I wonder, Susan, given your prior experience on the Hill, if you give us some insights on how Bob's willingness to work with Capitol Hill, and again, I come back to listening, and his willingness to compromise really helped him achieve a lot of his goals and objectives when it came to policies that needed congressional approval.
Oh, I think it's critical. I think that anyone who has ever functioned on the Hill, and I would argue private sector as well, but certainly in the Congress, there's sort of two layers there. You got the members and then you got the staff. And the members, nobody works for anybody else, right? They're theoretically working for the voters, but they don't work for each other. And the only thing that you have with you that is critical is your credibility, your integrity. And when somebody is interacting with a member of Congress, the critical thing for them is the integrity of that individual. And as you noted, Bob just sort of oozed integrity, and he was transparent, and he was upfront about what his thoughts were. And I think they respected that. And on a bipartisan basis, they respected that.
And Bruce, I know you spent time wandering around Capitol Hill in the days when you could walk around Capitol Hill unfettered and not afraid with the secretary. So share some of your thoughts about that.
I think more than anything else, Bob was a relationship person. He really understood how to make relationships in any situation. And what really would excite him is when it came to reaching across the aisle or going right into the belly of the beast and spending time with and really listening to those who would have been in another life very natural adversaries. So I remember, whether it was with Chairman Hollings or Chairman Dingell, the closeness of these interpersonal relationships, these were deep and profound friendships. And we would ask him, many of us who are a part of this roundtable, and he would always talk about how you have to give trust to get trust. And you had to really show you were willing to listen and to be a part of it in order to work things out and solve problems. And I think his private sector entrepreneurial side led him to those skills, and he relished it. Every time we went there, every time there was a supposed adversary, and he would have that handsome smile, the $1 million smile, and just say, let me at him.
I have to tell one of my quick favorite stories about Bob. We were going around Capitol Hill doing Bob's courtesy calls for his confirmation. and I was walking him around and taking him into offices and as his staff assistant. And we went to see one particular senator from Washington State, who was a very patrician fellow, very wealthy man who'd grown up, his family had been in Washington State for 38 generations or something. And he was a very serious kind of, stiff-necked fellow. And he started talking, and I was briefing Bob, and I said, this guy is not exactly a laugh a minute kind of a fellow. And Bob goes in and says, oh, you went to Groton, I went to Choate. And, they had this whole incredible conversation. The first time anyone ever saw this particular senator open up. And they had this real connection about boarding school and the life and all of that and the various activities. It was fantastic. So I walked down and I said, wow, that was terrific. And I said, now look, our next guy is this new freshman from Montana who used to be a cattle auctioneer, whatever the hell that is. I'd never heard of that, of course, being from New York. And so I said, so Bob, I think you're going to have to play down. So he looks at me, he says, hey, I got this. Don't worry about it. So we go in, we see this fellow, Senator Burns, and Bob says, so Conrad, and he's giving him the full Texas thing. And they get into this whole conversation about cattle and ranches and all this. It was amazing. And I walked out and I turned to him and I said, Bob, what the hell am I doing here, man? You got this. This is amazing. He really knew how he had such a varied life experience, and he just knew instantly how to connect with people in a very genuine way, but in a fun way. I don't think anybody ever left a meeting. Well, it may have been a few people who left meetings with Bob that that they didn't have fun, but most of the time, everybody felt very good about it. Just turning a little bit to the policy side, I remember that the big concern back when we were all working on these trade issues was about Japan and our competition with Japan. Big trade deficits, lots of technology competition. The Japanese were aggressively investing in various businesses in the United States. And I wonder if, and it was a bipartisan concern then, and I wonder if that's similar, and Susan, I'm going to come back to you on this, if it's similar to the way we have bipartisan concerns about our trade relationship with China today.
Well, yes and no. So the good news and the bad news, it's bipartisan today, but it's bipartisan in a very different way. So at the time that Japan was the big challenge and we had the big trade deficit with Japan, and we were debating both market access issues in terms of the Japanese market and Japan shipping cars here. That was bipartisan, except it was bipartisan based on region. So members of Congress who had export interests, whether they were agriculture or manufacturing, were pro-trade and were anti-protectionist. And members of Congress who had import-sensitive constituencies, like autos, at the time, were anti-trade or were perfectly happy to put up trade barriers, whether they were Republicans or Democrats. So the split in trade attitudes came down on bipartisan and regional constituent lines. Within the next 20 years, you had it become more partisan, where you had a lot of Democrats start to become anti-trade. That has changed, where the bipartisanship has come back, particularly vis-a-vis China. And there, the magnitude of the deficit with China is an issue, but much more than that. It is this perception that US companies and US workers are having to compete with a government. So state-owned enterprises and state-subsidized enterprises and industrial policies and non-market economies. And there isn't a level playing field. And that has created a lot of consternation. And yet at the same time, the Chinese market is significantly more open than the Japanese market was in the 1980s. The US exported more than $100 billion to China last year. So there are a lot of American workers and farmers who are benefiting tremendously from access to the Chinese market. Again, the big difference, China is a strategic adversary, whereas Japan was an ally. So there are a lot of differences, but the concern is clearly bipartisan again, but for rather different reasons.
I wonder, Tom, if the erosion of that bipartisan consensus on trade that really began when we were in government, would have it wouldn't have happened. There would still be a more of a consensus that trade is good for America's economy, good for workers. If we had really followed Bob's view, and all of you have heard Bob say this 1,000 times, which is we want free trade, we want fair trade, and we're going to be tough negotiators. Tom, tell us how you see this new situation on trade.
Well, I have to tell you a little story about Bob's approach to tough negotiating, though, because maybe it was because of his long experience in business or the hard knocks of the oil and gas industry, but the secretary had very little patience for the formalities and the niceties and all of that of foreign diplomatic negotiations. He wanted results for America. He wanted results for his president, and he was kind of anxious about getting them quickly. He'd give you that, let's go. Everyone who worked for him knows this. This is when the debate's over, as Wayne said earlier, and now let's go get it done. But we were in Japan in early 1992. This was the famous trip. We were traveling with the president and with a bunch of CEOs. And this was the famous trip where, unfortunately, the president didn't feel well one night, and the prime minister of Japan's dinner suit paid the price. But the following day, actually, the secretary had a scheduled session with Meaty Minister Watanabe. And I remember we were out in the hallway, and I forget which breathless, career servant who was with us handed him the talking points. And it was kind of the same old gruel. And the secretary was very anxious to come away with something on this trip, particularly with all the press now on the president falling ill. He really felt it was on his shoulders to come up with something. And the session was supposed to be about market access for car parts. And it's something, as Wayne and Susan, all of you would know, we talked a lot about and made very little progress over a long period of time. And that wasn't really something the secretary appreciated. So we get into the meeting room, usual deal. There's 8 people on their side and 8 people on our side, and we're all kind of looking at each other, and they're going to deliver their talking points, and Bob's going to deliver his. And the meaty minister welcomes them. He says, "What would you like to start?" And he looks at the talking points, and he literally took the cards and threw them across the table at the meaty minister and said, "Well, you might as well take these, because it's the same old stuff I've been telling you for a long time. But here's the deal," and it was a great moment. It was somewhat unconventional. It was dramatic. But with the president literally convalescing down the hall in this big palace in Tokyo, it had an impact. And by golly, a day later, as we're leaving Japan, we had concessions on access and car parts. And, he got it done. I don't think it's something his friend, the president, would have agreed to on the front end as a negotiating strategy, but it did work. It did work.
Yeah. Oh, Tom, I love you reminding me of this. Yeah. All of us. Well, Tom, let me stay with you for just a second. You worked obviously for Secretary Baldrige. You worked in the Reagan administration, and you worked for President Bush 41 in the White House when he was vice president for the entire most of his time there. And I think you saw a lot of different cabinet members behave in different ways, and use the press and Congress and other people to try to push their particular point of view. But one of the things that was always a hallmark of working for Bob was that you always knew where he stood, but you never read about it when he disagreed with others in the administration, or even disagreed with the president, or was trying to persuade the president of something. So tell the audience a little bit about how you watched him operate in the environment in Washington, where people use leaks and the media and the Congress to get things done, and the difference with the way Bob approached things.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Wayne, that's a really important observation to his effectiveness as a cabinet secretary. He didn't wear his friendship with the president on his sleeve. He didn't have to. But he lived by a certain code, and you just described it. And, if you had a disagreement with a friend, a colleague, with your boss, you dealt with that behind closed doors, and you didn't embarrass somebody, and you didn't box them in, and you were respectful. It's written about, there's a great memoir that Bob published that Jim McGrath, who worked for President Bush, helped him with. And in there's the story about how Bob was very concerned in the run-up to the re-election that the administration wasn't getting its economic messaging right, that the president wasn't being allowed to show the proper empathy for Americans who were having a tough time economically. And he was really in a bit of a internal brawl with Secretary Brady and Governor Sununu and Dick Darman, who ran the Office of Management and Budget. But he played by the rules, and he talked to those guys individually behind the scenes. And eventually he said to them, well, you know what, I just disagree with you, and I'm going to talk to the president. And the president said, okay, write me the speech I should give. And so I remember he came back. He said, all right, guys, I asked for it. Now I got it. We better figure it out. Right, Bruce? That was a exciting exercise.
That was a nice night.
It was a long night, that's for sure. But, it was nice of you to mention Secretary Baldrige. He was a hell of a secretary as well. But with Bob, he was a great friend of the president's. And there's something about that makes a big difference in Washington when you have a seat around the cabinet table. I want to just take a minute. Gene Becker, who I think is listening in tonight, reminded me about this letter that appeared in President Bush's book, All the Best. And it's written to Jim Baker and Bob Mosbacher on February 5th, 2009. I'll just read it quickly. Dear Jim and Bob, as I headed back to the office after our lunch today, I had a serious thought. I wanted to share it with you. All three of us have had power lunches with famous people. As John Connolly once put it, I have dined with kings and potentates. But the lunch we had today was simply a lunch between dear friends. We didn't have an agenda. None of us were trying to get our photo taken by that intrusive, persistent camera lady who has become a minor pain in the ass. All we had was the joy of real friendship. And what a treasure and joy it really is. I'm a very lucky guy, and I know it. And I want to be sure you two know that I feel that way, and that I am grateful to you both. I always will be. We have all sat at head tables, but our little table today trumps any head table in the world. When I say my prayers tonight, I will give thanks for the friendships we share and honor. George. It just captures the special relationship that Bob had with the president. And I have never, in all my time in Washington, seen anyone project and model loyalty the way Secretary Mosbacher projected and modeled loyalty to his boss. And that's a lesson, frankly, that I carried with me through the rest of my career. And I know the rest of us most likely have as well.
Well, Tom, that was a wonderful thank you for sharing that with all of us, with the audience, and with all of us. Bruce, I want to move off of trade and talk a little bit about the rest of the Commerce Department, which is actually, oddly enough, most of the Commerce Department in terms of employees and budget, but very little of the Commerce Department that gets any notice or is ever commented on in the media. It's an agency, Commerce is an agency that is home to hundreds of scientists. Secretary Mosbacher had 2 distinguished PhDs leading the 2 largest parts of commerce. We had Dr. John Knaus, a world famous oceanographer, who was the head of the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Yeah, that's a mouthful. And then Dr. Barbara Bryant, who ran the census, and little known about the census. People know they have to do it every 10 years, but there are a lot of scientists, mathematicians, data scientists, PhDs. Both were appointed early. Bob interviewed them and went through an extensive vetting process. And, you know, these two scientists were not political. I don't know what, to this day, don't really know what their politics were. And neither of them ever said they had been muzzled or they couldn't get their views across, or that Bob was trying to pressure them to come to a different conclusion. And I think it's interesting, Bruce, talk a little bit about how Bob encouraged all of us and even the non-political folks, the professors, as I called them, to debate and to dissent. And he invited that. He hosted it. He insisted on it, really, in some ways. And you might tell us the fun story about the census officials who had a rather vigorous debate right in front of the secretary.
That's a great point, Wayne. And I think all of us really recognize that the spirit of trust and transparency began at our legendary Saturday fireside meetings. And we would get together and we were encouraged to be somewhat boundaryless in our discussions. He also had great respect for the science, and whether it was the data science of the census and making certain that every individual, whether they were undocumented or documented, they were all counted. He also had great respect for the Interagency Planning Group on Climate Change and weather and the issues around NOAA. But he did clearly understand the difference between the technical and the adaptive. He knew the difference between policy and science. He respected science, and he also respected the policymakers who would listen to the scientists who were given unfettered access to all of the policymakers in the department and throughout the administration. And two areas where I think that really came back to instruct us were in areas related to weather and also in counting every American, everybody within our borders. And again, that included undocumented aliens. So Bob allowed the scientists to debate issues and talk about the data, but he also understood what was the policy role that he had been charged with. And in numerous examples, and I think the one in the census is probably the most interesting, and Wendell played a tremendous role in enabling the right outcome. Record numbers of individuals were counted from every aspect of the ideological and ethnic perspective. So with that, Wendell, do you want to talk about the census?
I think that's a great idea, Bruce. Wendell, tell us also about the whole issue around statistically adjusting the census and Bob's decision. Walk us through that.
Yeah. Let me just say at the outset, Wayne, I think the way you teed up the discussion, talking about Bob's personal qualities, really resonated with me. And, you know, to use President Bush's phrase, it was a kinder and gentler time. And Bob epitomized that. And he did work towards consensus and collegiality and knew how to reach across the aisle, but he did not shirk from the tough decisions either. And I think that what Bruce has said about listening to the scientists, but understanding the distinction between science and policy was absolutely on point. And when it came to the census, as people like Governor Engler know, the census, you know, every 10 years, tough decisions need to be made. They're policy decisions with political implications. And it's a zero-sum game at the end of the day. And the direction to the census, with ample support from the Secretary's office, was to try to find and count everyone. And that's not limited to citizens, because that's not the way the Constitution is written. You're meant to count every person. But you know that in the conduct of any census, no matter how conscientiously undertaken, you're going to miss a certain percentage of the population. This is the population that is undercounted. And you could think, you knew what kinds of people were more likely to be undercounted: urban, renters, so on and so forth, minorities. And you did the best possible job that you could. And the question was, could you correct the census by adjusting for the undercount? And Bob's approach, which we recommended to him, was that we do the best possible job to find everyone, and we look at the science that might support adjusting for undercount. And this was all a very transparent process. It was a very controversial path that we trod, and at the end of the day, it's a zero-sum game. Either you're going to do this or not, and what are the implications of it? And I remember Bill Barr telling me, you can't even look at that because it's unconstitutional. The problem was the lawyers at the Justice Department were saying, well, Bill can say that, but you're going to lose in court if you take that position. So we went through this process to evaluate adjusting. And at the end of the day, the statisticians disagreed. And the head of the Census Bureau, who was a political appointee, Barbara Bryant, who I think actually had been recommended by Bob Teeter, recommended that we adjust. The career deputy recommended against adjustment. But the criteria that was applied was, could you improve on the results for the purpose that the census is undertaken? Not simply to add to the count, but to improve the results for which the census is undertaken. In other words, not only did you miss people, where do people live, and what are the implications of that for redistricting, reapportionment, and apportionment of federal funds? And the experts came back and they were divided on this. And Bob said, if they're divided, then I think that we just do not adjust. The whole process was very transparent. It was clear that that was our orientation, unless the science was clear and convincing the other way. It was not. So there was a lot of criticism. There was a lot of litigation, and the decision was taken up to the Supreme Court, where Bob's decision was upheld 9-0.
Well, I remember well the call from Bob to me that day of the 9-0 decision being announced, and he was very happy, very proud of how it went, and it was really quite a strong move to make that decision and to be open about the different debate that went on internally. I think I've got time for one more question to the panel, and then maybe we can get some questions from some of the other folks here with us. The first thing we tackled when we all finally got into commerce after the Secretary's confirmation and some of the rest of us went through the process was a dispute with the Japanese about how much technology from a particular type of technology that went into fighter jets was going to be made available to the Japanese to produce a version of this particular fighter jet. And the deal had been struck in the Reagan administration. Everybody thought it was going to sail through. And Bob looked at it and got a series of briefings and decided that this was something that required more study, and ended up challenging the decision going forward, and really had an effect on exactly how that technology was transferred. Additionally, this became, because commerce has a very significant role in licensing technology, and something we're talking about still all these years later, about how much technology we're allowing people to share, and what's stolen and what's misused and all of that. And so Bob had a very thoughtful approach to the implementation of export controls. And something that I think isn't widely known about his tenure was that he really set the country on a course of thinking about how technology was transferred even to allies and how that was managed, how it was evaluated, and what the process within the government with the various agencies should look like and how it should operate. And I think, Wendell, you may have some additional insights into that to share, but I think that's a very important part of Bob's legacy that I wanted to discuss briefly here. We had just a couple of minutes left.
Yes, and I think, the question of export controls, we came in at a time when COCOM had been so extraordinarily successful, right, in bringing the Soviet Empire to its knees. And now there's a lot of debate about how the export control position should be filled at Commerce under the new administration, because with the hardening of the relationship with the PRC and the increasing national security challenge that the Chinese represent, there's new focus on the export licensing function that's housed within Commerce.
I think it is, something that no one expected. This incredibly articulate and charming oil man from Houston, who hadn't been a student of these issues, to dig so deeply into within really the first 3 weeks. Tom, we will remember this. The first 3 weeks, Tom had to get a special room constructed there so Bob could have these super secret briefings and so forth. And but Bob took it very seriously, understood what the consequences were, and had this ability to look around the corner at where this was going to go in the future, which was always fascinating to me as a longtime protege of Bob's, as we all were. So I think we have some time here, about 6-7 minutes. If there are some questions, I think one of our friends from the Mosbacher Institute is going to come back on. I think it's Samantha.
Yes. Hi.
Oh, here's Samantha, but I don't see Samantha, but that's okay. Samantha, do we have some questions from folks that we can
do. Can
tackle?
You hear me? I'm not sure why
Perfectly.
You can't see me. Well, thank you. I just want to say thank you all so much for this discussion. Truly, it is so fascinating to hear your stories and your remarks working together. I'm Samantha Service. I'm currently a Bush student and an ambassador to the Bush School. And I get the honor of asking you guys just a couple of questions as we have some time. And so my first question is and you can each answer this however you want, but what advice would you give yourselves if you had to go back and make certain decisions over again while serving in the Commerce Department?
Well, let's start with Tom on that one. That's a good question.
I rarely listen to the advice I give myself, but I think it was talked about earlier. I think some of the best things we learned from Bob were about listening, and I would just put a plug in for, Wayne mentioned what a wide expanse of responsibilities the Commerce Department has, but with that comes a huge army of career civil servants who, by and large, and for the most part, and I don't even mean to qualify it, are there because they're dedicated to public service. And I think it's very important, that particularly as we're beginning a new administration here in Washington, that political appointees going into positions need to understand the importance of listening to the experts and to the career public servants who are in these agencies, because they have the knowledge, they have the history, and for the most part, they come to the table with clean hands, wanting to serve the new administration.
Susan?
I definitely agree with Tom. I think the career civil servants get a bad rap, and they are invaluable in terms of the role that they play. The other lesson I mentioned at the top end of the program, which is think big, go big, and I was pushed into that, and I will be forever grateful. And finally, you sort of alluded to it, Wayne, which is there is no downside to being nice and respectful to other people, and not burning bridges. You never know. It's certainly not in Washington. You never know where people are going to end up. And so it is one of those lessons that you learn over and over and over again in Washington. And I certainly learned it at Commerce.
Bruce?
Maybe more than anything else, I think Bob taught me how to be an optimist and to work hard, but also reminding me throughout my life that blue skies follow the storm, and understanding where you are, when to reef the sails. I'm saying it like I actually know what that means, but he used to say it. And just remembering it, because no one likes to follow a pessimistic leader.
Boy, that's true. Wendell?
I think the audience can tell we all love the guy, right? And we loved him because of his charm, his magnetism, his willingness to listen. And, he was an inspiring kind of guy, not because he was great at rhetoric. He was not. He didn't give great speeches. You could give him a great speech and he wasn't going to give it because that wasn't him. He was going to be himself, right? There was an authenticity about him, including the personal qualities that have been spoken to. And that's what made being on that team such a fond memory and a continuing inspiration for all of us.
I think the lesson I learned from Bob, who was a very important mentor to me before and after Commerce, really gets back to his own personal characteristics of respecting people and being polite and being a gentleman. He once pulled me aside early on in our time in Commerce, and he said, there's a big difference between confidence and arrogance. And sorting that out is a really important part of maturity. And that was in 1989. So, a long time ago. And I still remember exactly what he said. I remember exactly where we were when he said it to me. And it's a lesson that I'm still constantly trying to remind myself of from time to time, and an important one. Samantha, do you have, there's Samantha. Okay. Oh, technology. Samantha, do you have other questions you'd like to ask? I think we've got a couple minutes left for one more.
Yeah, we have about just 2 minutes left. I'll ask, one question came in for Tom, and it was, can you expand on the memorable travel tips with heads of state and the secretary?
Well, it's hard to choose, but it strikes me that we're actually on the cusp of the 30th anniversary of the end of the Gulf War. And I had the honor of accompanying Secretary Mosbacher on the first non-military delegation to visit Kuwait once the war was ended. We went on a Kuwaiti plane with the ambassador here in Washington and a delegation, and which Bob led from the government side. And there was a lot of agencies, how we're going to help rebuild and all that. And we flew in, and all the oil fires were still burning in the desert. Those of you studying that period will see pictures of that. It was an incredible sight. One oil fire, if you're from Texas, is a big deal, and there were too many to count. We went down what was called rather grimly the highway of death, and we weren't allowed to get out of our cars because there was still live ordnance spread all over the highway. And then we went to the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington's personal residence, which had been completely ransacked and destroyed by the invading Iraqis. And I remember vividly Bob consoling the ambassador. And I saw a side of him that I still, you can tell I carry it with me today, but it was a touching and moving moment of two new friends just sharing that grief and the joy that, this horrible chapter had come to an end and that there was a bright future. So I don't know, from travel highlights, that one sort of sticks with me today, particularly that it's the 30th anniversary coming up here later this month.
Well, thank you, Samantha, and thanks to everyone. I think Ray is coming back on to help us sign off. And there's Ray.
Howdy, y'all. Yeah, thank you all so much for such a wonderful evening. I mean, the stories of respect, transparency, honesty, loyalty. And you notice that one of Secretary Mosbacher's greatest lessons was listening, and I could listen to y'all talk for hours. You've really inspired all of us. Thank you so much for your time. And you're such a wonderful testimony to the amazing legacy of Bob Mosbacher. And we hope that you'll consider the Mosbacher Institute a second home. We really do. That's what we really want to be for you. And we'd also be honored to host all of y'all in person when the pandemic has passed. And until then, please receive our deepest thanks and appreciation and very best wishes. And to the audience, we'd also like to thank you all very much for joining us on this wonderful event. We hope you all have a great night and stay safe, and farewell until our next event. Thank you all very much.